Welcome to the Sino-Vatican Deal, a virtual conversation with George Weigel. I'm Chelsea Mikta, a research fellow at the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, and I'm so pleased to be joined today by George Weigel, a distinguished senior fellow in the William E. Simon Chair in Catholic Studies at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, as well as a member of our academic council here at VOC. George is the author of more than 20 books, including an internationally acclaimed 2-volume biography of Pope John Paul II. He received his BA from St. Mary's Seminary and University in Baltimore and his MA from the University of St. Michael's College in Toronto. He is the recipient of 19 honorary doctorates in fields such as divinity, philosophy, law, and social science, and has been awarded the Papal Cross Pro Ecclesia at Pontifice, Poland's Gloria Artis Gold Medal, and Lithuania's Diplomacy Star. During today's event, the Sino-Vatican Deal, George will unpack the recent decision by the Vatican to extend an agreement with Beijing over the appointment of bishops in China. We are honored to have George here to share his extensive knowledge of the history of Sino-Vatican relations and the broader significance of the 2018 deal and its implementation. Just a quick note on the run of the show. Following his presentation, George and I will have a brief conversation, and then I'll turn to questions submitted by the audience. You can submit questions for George throughout the presentation by using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. George, welcome. I know our audience is eager to learn more about the agreement, so I invite you to share your presentation with us.
Thank you, Chelsea. It's good to be with you, and I'm always happy to be part of programs sponsored by the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, which is not only an essential part of keeping the memory of those who suffered under communism alive, but very important in helping us think about the challenges that totalitarian and authoritarian regimes continue to present to freedom throughout the world. I think the first thing to be said about the Sino-Vatican Deal is that we don't know what it is. This arrangement that was consummated in 2018 has never been made public. That in itself is quite odd. What seems to have happened was that an agreement was made on how Catholic bishops would be appointed in China. This has been a long-standing point of contention between the Chinese Communist regime and the Holy See, the Vatican. The resolution that seems to have been agreed to was one in which the Chinese regime would present candidates for the office of Catholic bishop in China, which the Holy See could then accept or reject. If that, in fact, is the arrangement, it's deeply problematic in several respects. First of all, it violates the Church's own canon law. Canon 377.5 of the Code of Canon Law says that no concessions are to be given to governments in the appointment of bishops. So in making this agreement, the Church was violating its own legal system. Secondly, shortly after this agreement was made, there was a Congress of the Communist Party of the People's Republic of China. And during that, it was agreed that the Chinese Communist Party, not the state apparatus, but the party apparatus, would have responsibility for the oversight of religious affairs in China. So it's not just the question of the Vatican allowing the Chinese government to have an important say in the appointment of Catholic bishops in China. It's a matter of the Vatican agreeing to the Chinese Communist Party having a say in the appointment of Catholic bishops in China. Now, before I continue, I'm going to step behind myself and close the window to my study because my neighbor is cutting their lawn and it's making a big racket. Don't go away. There we go. Sorry for that brief interruption, but that should make things easier for me and for everyone else. A third reason why the agreement made in 2018 and reaffirmed last year is deeply problematic is that the Xi Jinping regime in China has made it quite clear that all religious bodies in China are to be instruments of propagating the Xi Jinping faith if they are to be allowed to propagate their own religious faith. This kind of cooperation with an atheistic totalitarian regime, which is committing what the United States Department of State considers a genocide of Muslim Uyghurs in Xinjiang province in northwest China, a regime that is clamping down on the civil liberties of the people of Hong Kong in direct violation of the agreement it made with the United Kingdom in 1997 when sovereignty over Hong Kong reverted to China. This is not the kind of regime that the Vatican should trust in carrying out its agreements. Now, those are some of the problems. How did this happen? It happened, I think, because there has never been a serious intellectual reckoning in the Vatican, in the pontifical universities in Rome, with the failures of Vatican diplomacy in Central and Eastern Europe in the 1960s and 1970s. In the early 1960s, Pope John the 23rd wanted to create a new dialogue between the Catholic Church and the communist regimes of Central and Eastern Europe. There had been no such conversation since the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 in Russia. And with the Soviet Union as the hegemon of a good half of Europe, John the 23rd thought it was imperative to get some sort of conversation going. In the middle years of the 1960s, that policy, that attempt to create a new conversation between the church and communist regimes was implemented by a man named Agostino Casaroli, an Italian archbishop, a member of the Vatican Diplomatic Corps, an extremely able man, I might say, a very charming man, and I discovered in my encounters with him, but not a man who, in my judgment, ever took the full measure of what Marxism-Leninism was and is, whether in its Soviet form or its East German form or its Polish form or now its Chinese form. Casaroli created in the mid-1960s what came to be known as the Vatican Ostpolitik, its Eastern politics. This had a number of features. It involved a muting, a tamping down, if you will, of the church's public criticism, and particularly the Vatican's public criticism of communist regimes. It involved trying to find what Casseroli used to describe in Latin as not a modus vivendi, but a modus non moriendi, a way of not dying for the church in these atheistic regimes. And that necessitated finding ways to keep the sacramental life of the church alive in communist societies. That required priests, and to have priests, you got to have bishops to ordain priests. So Casseroli, from the late 1960s on, excuse me, went really country by country in Central and Eastern Europe, trying to effect different arrangements with the communist regimes of the time in order for the structural life of the church to continue, in order that its sacramental life might continue. He made some real progress, as he understood progress, in Hungary. Didn't get very far at all in what was then Czechoslovakia, Poland, or East Germany. Got essentially nowhere in Romania and Bulgaria. But the conversations continued. These arrangements, this Ostpolitik, was frankly quite resented by many active Catholics in Central and Eastern Europe. And while church leaders in those countries maintained a discreet silence about what the Vatican was doing, most of them thought they knew the situation better than Italian papal diplomats, and they were not, the men on the scene were not terribly happy with this accommodating approach to communist regimes that was represented by Casseroli, the Ostpolitik, which continued throughout the pontificate of Pope Paul VI. When Paul VI died in 1978, and John Paul II was elected, all of this changed. Now, it changed in a very interesting way. John Paul II appointed Agostino Casseroli to be his papal Secretary of State and made him a cardinal. So Archbishop Casseroli became Cardinal Casseroli. And he continued to pursue this accommodating approach, this negotiation approach to communist regimes. But meanwhile, the Pope, who had the far greater megaphone, was going to Poland in June 1979, was going to the United Nations in October 1979, and hammering communist regimes with a bold defense of the human rights of all and the religious freedom of all, igniting a revolution of conscience in Central and Eastern Europe that produced, among other things, the Solidarity movement in Poland. And John Paul II continued that sharp public critique of communist violations of human rights throughout the 1980s. So you had in that decade what amounted to a kind of good cop, bad cop approach to this. Cardinal Casseroli would continue his negotiations, but John Paul II was giving great public visibility to the persecuted churches, Catholic, but also Protestant and Orthodox, behind the Iron Curtain. Now, we know how that story ended. It ended in the Revolution of 1989, the liberation of Central and Eastern Europe from communist rule, the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the liberation of the Baltic states, who had been very supportive of John Paul II's approach to these problems, particularly in Lithuania. And yet, somehow, the papal diplomatic corps never learned the lesson of all of this. It seems quite remarkable, even incomprehensible, that the people who are the professionals of Vatican diplomacy have not to this day reckoned with the failures of the old Casseroli Ostpolitik, or wrestled with the fact that it was this bold public defense of human rights, of religious freedom, that created space for the church and for other civil society institutions to operate in Central and Eastern Europe in the 1980s and produce the nonviolent revolution of 1989. This has simply not been grasped in the Vatican bureaucracy, I regret to report. It's been an extremely frustrating experience for me, having written numerous books about this, having documented from communist secret police materials just how ineffective the Ostpolitik of Cardinal Casseroli was, having excuse me, having demonstrated from those same materials just how deeply communist secret intelligence services had penetrated the Vatican in the 1970s, that these appropriate lessons have still not been drawn among the professionals in Vatican diplomacy. So what I see going on in China today, and what I have seen going on since before the 2018 agreement, is a kind of revival of the Casseroli Ostpolitik of the 1960s and 1970s by men who were proteges of Cardinal Casseroli. Several of the key figures in negotiating the Sino-Vatican Deal were proteges of Cardinal Casseroli. And I have, having known these men for over 2 decades, I have known how determined, even obsessed, they were with making some sort of an arrangement with Beijing that would eventually open the way to full diplomatic relations between the Holy See and the People's Republic of China. That's the grail at the end of this road. That's the pot of gold at the end of this highway, from the point of view of these men of Vatican diplomacy. Now, why they imagine that such an exchange of full diplomatic representation at the ambassadorial level between the Holy See and China would give the Vatican leverage in China, how it would ease the situation of the church in China, is a mystery to me, and a mystery to the Chinese Catholic leaders, like Cardinal Joseph Zen, the Emeritus Bishop of Hong Kong, who have been deeply critical of the deal that was made in 2018 and 2020. And yet, this continues to be pursued. The current Cardinal Secretary of State, Pietro Parolin, another protege of Cardinal Casseroli, just said the other day that while, things are going slowly in China, we still believe in this path of dialogue. Well, it's not clear that there's any real dialogue going on. If there were a genuine conversation, then perhaps one could make a prudential argument for this arrangement. But there is no dialogue of any consequence, particularly with a regime that, as it is making clear with the Uyghurs, as it's making clear in Hong Kong, is absolutely determined to hold on to totalitarian power through every means possible, including now the world's most comprehensive internal security system through the profiling of individuals and other violations of basic civil liberties. How one has a dialogue with a regime like this, whose prime imperative is its own survival, and which is willing to sacrifice everything, including elementary human decencies, to that survival, is not at all clear. So that's how I understand the background to this. I think it's a very misguided policy. I do not know whether this policy will continue beyond Pope Francis. There are a lot of people, a lot of senior people in the Catholic Church throughout the world who are very unhappy with this. I expect that in the next papal conclave to elect a pope, whenever that takes place, this question of China policy will be a significant issue. And I don't think the present policy is going to be praised by very many of the cardinal electors. So those are some opening thoughts.
Thank you, George, for an incredibly informative and expansive presentation. Before we turn to some of the questions from audience members, I wanted to ask a few questions and to dig a little bit deeper into some of these issues. Since the Sino-Vatican Deal was signed in September of 2018, as you said, the Chinese regime has committed atrocities against Uyghur Muslims, has violated its treaty with the United Kingdom over Hong Kong, to say nothing of its treatment of the Catholic Church in China itself. So what I'm really struggling to understand is why the Vatican, has renewed this agreement. Why have Vatican diplomats prioritized partnering with Xi's China? What do they want from this deal?
They think they're opening a path to a freer life for the Catholic Church in China. I think that is a deeply misguided judgment. They're just wrong about this. It's not working, as you say. This is a regime that has no interest in doing anything than making the Church in China subordinate to the goals of the Xi Jinping regime. And yet, for some reason, these men refuse to acknowledge this. Now, this would be even more incomprehensible if they hadn't done it 30 years ago. It was very clear at the time of Karol Wojtyła's election as John Paul II in 1978 that the Vatican Ostpolitik in Central and Eastern Europe was a failure. The Catholic Church in Hungary had become essentially a wholly owned subsidiary of the Hungarian communist regime's intelligence service. And the Hungarian College in Rome, its alleged seminary, was an East Bloc spy center. And, people who were paying attention understood this. The liveliest parts of the Catholic Church in Czechoslovakia, as it then was, had been battered badly while the Ostpolitik was going on. The man who would eventually become the Archbishop of a liberated Prague after 1989 was a window washer who could not function as a priest publicly, but was a window washer by day and a clandestine priest by night. The church continued to be under considerable pressure in Poland, and so forth and so on. And yet, these diplomats in the Vatican continued to insist that the Ostpolitik was working, as their successors continued to insist that this path of accommodation is the only path forward in China. Now, this kind of, how to put this gently, stubbornness, recalcitrance is not unique to the Holy See. There are diplomats in the United States government today who still believe you can make a credible and verifiable nuclear weapons deal or nuclear power deal with the Islamic Republic of Iran, despite all evidence that the Iranians continue to violate any agreement that's made. So there's a kind of, we would call this, in theological terms, we would call this fideism, a kind of will to believe that eventually takes over your prudential judgment and leads you in bad ways. The Vatican diplomats are not the only people susceptible to this, but what they don't seem to understand, Chelsea, is the deeper lesson of the John Paul II years. And that is that the only real power the Catholic Church and the Vatican have in world affairs is the power of moral witness. The Church, these are not the days of the Papal States when the popes ruled the middle 1/3 of Italy. And the Papal States were a kind of Class C European power, represented at the Congress of Vienna, deal making in the usual fashion. That's all over. But the cast of mind has not changed sufficiently. Moreover, there doesn't seem to be a recognition that this failure to take a public stance in defense of religious freedom and other basic human rights, as for example in the case of the Uyghurs, or in the case of my friends Jimmy Lai and Martin Lee, two Catholics, leaders of the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong. Jimmy's in jail right now. Martin's out on bail. Both of them have been convicted under the most absurd charges of laid by the Beijing regime through its lackeys in Hong Kong, and there's not a public word being said by the Vatican. That undercuts the Church's moral authority. And that's the only authority the Church has in world politics today, it seems to me.
I want to step back a minute and look at Pope Francis's pontificate kind of more broadly. How do you see this deal in the larger context of his pontificate? Does this mark a break with or a continuation of the policies of the past 7 years?
I think it's an expression of it. Pope Francis, as he says, is a great believer in dialogue. Pope Francis brought to the papacy, or Cardinal Bergoglio brought to the papacy, far less life experience in the political world than either of his two predecessors, and particularly John Paul II. The kind of deal that seems to have been made in 2018 and then reaffirmed in 2020, whereby the Church concedes to the Chinese regime the first move in the nomination of bishops. John Paul II could have had that deal. Benedict XVI could have had that deal. And neither one of them would make that deal because they understood it was bad for the church in both the short run and the long run. And this brings me to another point I might offer at the beginning of this conversation. I think this arrangement is deeply damaging the church's evangelical prospects in the China of the future. Chinese communism is like every other form of communism. It's not immortal. It's going to end at some point. Indeed, one might even suggest that the degree to which the Xi Jinping regime is tightening the screws throughout China today suggests a certain nervousness about the stability of the regime. Put that aside, though. Chinese communism is not immortal. It's going to end at some point, whether that's 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 50 years from now, or 100 years from now. Whenever it ends, China is going to be the greatest field of Christian mission since the Europeans came to the Western Hemisphere in the 16th century. The churches which have resisted, the Christian communities which have resisted the despised former regime would seem to me to have a comparative advantage in post-communist China. And the churches, the Christian communities that have cooperated with the now deposed or crumbled communist regime are going to be at a comparative disadvantage. So from every conceivable point of view, the present state of the church in China, the long-term future of Catholicism in a post-communist China, this just seems to me to be a very bad deal. And I'm sorry to have to say that. I don't take any pleasure in saying that. But it's the situation as I understand it, and as I believe the most serious and dedicated Catholics in China understand it.
I want to ask a follow-up question to that. Of course, you're right that the CCP will not be in power indefinitely. I'm curious about lessons that were learned or perhaps not learned from the Ostpolitik that you mentioned earlier. I mean, what kind of was the Catholic Church at a kind of evangelical disadvantage because of the years of pursuing Ostpolitik in that part of the world, or did John Paul II's legacy serve as a counterpoint to that damage? Could you say more about that?
Yeah, that's a good question. It really depends from situation to situation. The Catholic Church in Hungary was deeply damaged by the Ostpolitik, and now is led by a very capable man, Cardinal Peter Erdo of Budapest, but it has only begun to recover its vitality from the entire communist period. Church in Slovakia is in stronger shape. That was more of a resistance church during the Ostpolitik with some strong underground leadership. Church in the Czech Republic came to play a significant role in the Velvet Revolution at the end of 1989 and is at least holding its own right now. Church in Poland was always strong. The communists could never crack the close identification of the close link between Polish national identity and Catholicism. Poland's problem is slightly different today. I think the Polish problem is to imagine that you can go back to the church of the 1930s when in fact that's just not possible. And Catholicism, as post-modernity takes hold in Poland as it does throughout the Western world, the church has really cannot count on Polishness transmitting Catholicism seamlessly into the future. There's an interesting example, counterexample to what the Ostpolitik promoted and what's being promoted in China today in Ukraine. The Greek Catholic Church of Ukraine, the largest of the Eastern Catholic churches, these churches that are Byzantine in their liturgical form and their method of governing themselves, but that are fully in communion with the Bishop of Rome. The largest of those is the Greek Catholic Church in Ukraine. That was the world's largest illegal religious community for 40 years. Over 40 years, from 1946, when the Soviets attempted to dissolve it, until it reemerged from underground in 1990, 1991. The Greek Catholic Church in Ukraine is now vibrant, vital, has created the best university in the country, the Ukrainian Catholic University, out of nothing in 25 years, and played a leading role in the Maidan Revolution of Dignity in 2013 and 2014, having been a clandestine underground church for, as I say, almost 45 years. That lesson has not been learned in Vatican diplomacy at all. Similarly, in Lithuania, where there was a strong Catholic resistance, closely identified with Lithuanian national identity throughout the post-World War II period, the church is in reasonably strong shape today. So the lesson from all of that I take is that resistance strengthens you for the future, and accommodation simply accelerates the process of secularization, which seems to be built into certain forms of Western modernity.
There's an interesting paradox there in a way that eschewing an expressly political role actually can be more politically impactful in the long run. I want to turn to some of our audience questions.
Can I just say one word about that a second before we go?
Of course.
I think this is the lesson of John Paul II in Poland in June 1979. My friend John Lewis Gaddis at Yale, author, really America's premier historian of the Cold War, got this exactly right when he said the beginning of the end of European communism was June 2nd, 1979, when John Paul II got off the plane at Warsaw Airport and began those remarkable 9 days. But what happened during those 9 days? He didn't talk about politics or economics once.
Nope.
He said in 50-some variations on one great theme, you, Polish people, are not who they, the communist regime, say you are. Permit me to remind you who you really are. You're a people with a distinctive culture, a distinctive history formed by Christian faith. If you reclaim that and own that, you will eventually find tools of resistance that communism cannot match. If you reclaim the truth of yourself culturally, you will find tools of resistance that communism cannot match. And that was borne out. Now, secular human rights activists like Václav Havel in Czechoslovakia during the 1970s would call that living in the truth. And it did prove a powerful means of resistance. It's the only form of resistance you have when the bad guys have all the material power. But it can be quite effective.
We have a question about what the agreement means for the church in Taiwan. Whether the Vatican is distancing itself from the active church in Taiwan.
The agreement really has nothing to do with the church in Taiwan. Catholic Church in Taiwan is obviously free to be the church. The Republic of China on Taiwan still has full diplomatic relations with the Holy See. It's one of the Holy See Taiwan diplomatic relationship is one of the few that Taiwan has left. Now, were this present course of Vatican policy to lead eventually to full diplomatic relations between the Holy See and Beijing, that would be the end of the Holy See's diplomatic relationship with Taiwan. I think perhaps the larger dimension of the question and the answer is that any approach to the Xi Jinping regime, which in any way validates it or accommodates to it, increases pressure on Taiwan. Taiwan is the first Chinese democracy in 5,000 years of Chinese history. It would be shameful if the West, if the democratic world, were to abandon the first Chinese democracy in 5,000 years of Chinese civilization. It would be even more shameful if the Catholic Church were to abandon the first Chinese democracy in 5,000 years. But at the moment, I think the only impact on this is that it may, by, in some sense, validating Xi Jinping and his agenda, be increasing somewhat the pressure on our friends in Taiwan.
We also have a question about how this deal might affect Hong Kong. How this deal might affect Catholic schools in Hong Kong, and especially the persecution facing Catholics in Hong Kong.
Well, it's certainly not helping. And while Cardinal Zen, the Emeritus Bishop of Hong Kong, was a fierce defender of the civil rights of the people of Hong Kong, and has been a fierce critic of this new Vatican policy. His successor as Bishop of Hong Kong has been less vocal. And as the regime in Beijing continues to increase its chokehold on Hong Kong, one can only imagine that the Catholic schools there, which are very respected by a lot of people who are not Catholics for their educational excellence, are going to come under increasing pressure to simply become regime instruments like other schools throughout China are. Sorry. Pollen season in the Washington area. So this is not good for Hong Kong at all. And as I said a moment ago, this muting of the Vatican's voice in defense of basic human rights in China is particularly shameful in relationship to Hong Kong, where so many of the principal leaders of the human rights and democracy movement, men like Jimmy Lai and Martin Lee, are themselves very, very serious and faithful Catholics.
Can you talk more about the effort underway to suppress unregistered and underground church branches in China?
The grand strategy here is pretty clear. The Chinese regime is determined to make any remnant of civil society a subsidiary of the state. This is the nature of totalitarianism going back to Mussolini. Remember the famous definition of fascism in Mussolini's Italy: everything within the state, everything for the state, nothing outside the state. Well, that's what's going on in China. What is interesting, to go back to a point we were discussing a moment ago, is that these Protestant house churches in China, which are under great pressure from the regime, continue to grow. Well, whereas Catholic population growth in China seems to have plateaued at the moment. So here again, persecution met with resistance seems to strengthen religious communities, whereas a more accommodating approach tends to weaken them. But there should be no confusion about the fact that this Chinese regime is truly totalitarian. It wants everything to be subordinate to its power and authority, and it wants everything to promote its ideology. Therefore, you have this requirement in recent years that churches of whatever denomination post these placards of what is so-called Xi Jinping thought inside the churches, as if this is not only the equivalent of the Bible, to take one example, but it's the superior wisdom here. The banning of young people from churches is obviously an attempt to choke off the future of religious communities. And that's before we get to the demolition of religious shrines, churches being knocked down, et cetera, et cetera. Now, China's a big place. And, things can be different from region to region, and things can be more difficult for religious communities in one region than they are in others. But the regime intent seems to me to be very clear here, and that is the total subordination of all forms of human association in China to the state, which in this case means the Communist Party.
Have members of the diplomatic community within the Vatican responded to criticism of the conciliatory approach they've adopted towards China? Has there been any response to those criticisms, or no?
Not really. I mean, I have tried to raise these issues, I hope reasonably politely, but also with a firmness in defense of my persecuted friends in China. I get nowhere. Cardinal Zen has not received anything approaching an open hearing in the Vatican these days. For a pontificate that prides itself on dialogue, there's a notable lack of dialogue on this policy, and that is very unfortunate.
We have a question about how to respond to the argument that this deal will help to bridge the gap between the largely underground Catholic Church in China and the regime-sponsored Patriotic Catholic Association. And you've kind of touched upon that.
Yeah.
But do you have any additional thoughts?
Yeah, I think, well, this was actually happening organically under John Paul II and Benedict XVI. There were Patriotic Catholic Association clergy, including bishops, who had written privately to the Vatican, making clear their loyalty to the Pope. So the gap was beginning to close between these two bodies. And in fact, the border between them is rather more permeable even today than it can sometimes seem. What this deal has done, I'm afraid, is to make it ever more likely that the leadership of the Patriotic Catholic Association, its priests and bishops, are not going to be the kind of men who are going to be loyal to the Universal Church or to the Pope. They are going to be regime agents, period. So the gap will now broaden between the so-called underground church and the so-called patriotic church. That's another terribly unfortunate byproduct of this policy, but it does seem to me quite inevitable as long as this approach continues. Men who are essentially chosen by the Religious Affairs Department of the Chinese Communist Party are not likely to be, as bishops, are not likely to be the kind of people who over time will show themselves either defenders of their Catholic people or men willing to acknowledge the religious authority of the Pope.
So we've got about 5 minutes left, and I want to ask you a kind of a question that looks to the future. What would you like to see the Vatican? How would you like to see the Vatican's policy towards China going forward? And what do you think would need to happen for a shift in policy to occur in the Holy See?
Well, the present policy will continue to be pursued as long as Pope Francis remains the Bishop of Rome. He seems fully committed to this. There doesn't seem to be any willingness to reconsider whether, however well-intentioned, this policy was ultimately quite imprudent and created even worse problems for the Church in China. So the first requisite is new leadership in the papacy. As I said in my opening remarks, I do not think this present policy is being applauded throughout the world church, including a notable lack of applause from the men who will elect the next pope. It seems to me that many of the Catholic bishops of Asia are deeply concerned with this policy because they believe it strengthens the hand of a Chinese regime that they don't want to see having further hegemonic power in Asia. I think that's true of the Cardinal and Cardinal Bo in Myanmar. I think that's true of the Cardinal in Indonesia, whose name is escaping me right now. So, assuming that a Pope willing to look at this anew succeeds Pope Francis, I think the first thing to do is to say to the Chinese regime, I'm sorry, we are going to obey our own canon law, and you are not going to have any say in the appointment of bishops. We're just not going to make this concession. Now, if you fellows want to have a discussion about this in which we retain the final say, and you don't nominate, but we'll talk to you, we could consider that. But we're not going to have a situation in which the Chinese Communist Party nominates and all we can say is no, because as you Chinese communists know, we're not going to say no forever. At some point, we're going to say yes to somebody. I think a much more vigorous defense of the human rights of all in China is essential. Pope Francis did not mention China in his Easter message 3 days ago. Mentioned a couple of other things, talked about Syria, talked about climate. But there's a genocide going on in Xinjiang right now. This needs to be addressed. So those are two immediate things: a much more vocal defense of human rights, and a frank statement that we're not going to pursue this policy of giving the Chinese regime or the Chinese Communist Party a significant role in appointing bishops. Those are the two essentials.
Well, I think we're going to wrap up this conversation. It's been such a delight to chat with you about these issues. Thank you to everyone for joining us and for your really insightful questions. Before we all go, I want to flag the next event that VOC will be hosting. So on April 28th at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, we have the honor to host Dr. Sean McMeekin, the Francis Flournoy Professor of European History and Culture at Bard College and a member of the Academic Council at VOC. Dr. McMeekin will be discussing his latest book, Stalin's War, which draws on new research in Soviet, European, and US archives to reframe our understanding of that global conflict by moving its epicenter to the east. So really excited about that conversation. I think it's going to be an incredibly stimulating one. Thank you again, George, and thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you.